"You're a fraud, Lena!" Daniel's voice echoed like thunder in that small makeshift gallery, causing all eyes to turn to me. My hands trembled as I held the painting he had just rejected with a cruel smile on his face. I felt the weight of each sharp word as if they were digging into my skin. The air was thick with embarrassment, silence, and curious glances. For a moment, I thought about giving up. I felt my legs wobble, and hot tears began to form in my eyes. But then, something inside me ignited. A spark of anger, of wounded pride, of determination. I looked Daniel straight in the eye, even though my heart was pounding in my chest like an out-of-control drum. "This isn't over," I muttered softly but firmly. He laughed, thinking I was bluffing. Oh, how wrong he was. If you want to know how I turned that devastating moment into an epic victory, sign up now. You'll follow my journey of overcoming adversity, art, and unforgettable revenge. I guarantee it will inspire and surprise you until the very last chapter. I'm Lena Harper. And if you had seen me in that makeshift gallery in Melbourne, with my hands covered in paint and my eyes filled with tears, you might not have imagined that I would be capable of changing so much. But here I am, telling you my story. I've always been a dreamer. Ever since I was a child, I would scribble on any piece of paper I could find. Art was my refuge, the place where I could put everything I felt when words failed me. I knew I wanted to make a living from it, but not everyone believed in me. And that's where Daniel Carter comes in. He was the kind of person who seemed to have all the answers, or at least he thought he did. Tall, overly confident, always with that attitude of someone who knows more than everyone around him. Daniel also liked art, but in a different way than I did. For him, it was more about status, recognition, and proving to the world that he was special. He spoke like a renowned critic, analyzing every stroke of other people's work with an air of superiority. At first, I thought he was a friend, someone who could encourage me. How wrong I was. Daniel had this cruel ability to make you doubt yourself, without raising his voice. He never yelled. His words were like sharp knives, cutting slowly and silently. He would say things like, "Lena, this isn't art, it's just an attempt." Or, "Do you really think anyone will pay for this?" Each sentence was a small wound he opened, and I kept them all inside me until I started to believe that maybe he was right. But there was something about him I didn't quite understand. An almost obsessive ambition for the Aurora Gallery, an iconic space in the city. He talked about it as if it were his destiny, the place where the world would finally see his worth. And while he dreamed of those walls, I worked tirelessly on my canvases, determined to prove him wrong. Not just wrong about me, but about what it means to be a real artist. If you want to understand how this rivalry between us turned into something much bigger, and how I used Daniel's own ambition against him, stay with me. This story will show you that no one can decide your worth but you. My apartment in Melbourne was small, but it had a window that looked out onto the heart of the city. At night, the lights from the buildings twinkled like distant stars, and I would sit there for hours, trying to capture that glow on my canvases. The smell of fresh paint always lingered in the air, mixed with the aroma of strong coffee I brewed to keep me awake during the long hours of work. There was something almost magical about that combination. The bitterness of the coffee with the slight sweetness of the oil paints that made me feel alive, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. The floor was covered with dirty rags and vibrant colors, as if creativity itself had spilled out onto the canvases. The walls were organized chaos, incomplete sketches, hastily scribbled inspirations, and even some critiques I kept, not as daggers, but as reminders of why I needed to keep going. Sometimes I would stop and press my forehead against the cold glass, watching the movement outside. Cars honked, people rushed against the clock, and I wondered if anyone, anywhere, had ever felt the same weight I felt now. In winter, the wind blew cold through the cracks in the window, and I wrapped my hands in old gloves to keep them from stiffening in the cold while I painted. The sound of the brush sliding across the canvas was like a silent melody, a dialogue between me and the work that was coming into being. When I worked, the outside world disappeared, and all that remained was that intense exchange of emotions and colors. I could feel the weight of each layer of paint, as if I were building something alive, something that breathed and pulsed with me. But it wasn't always like that. There were days when the silence of the apartment seemed suffocating, when the sound of my own breathing echoed too loudly. At times like these, I would look at the walls and see the reflections of all my doubts. And then I would hear Daniel's voice in my head, mocking me. But even in the darkest moments, that space was my refuge, and also my arena. It was there that I fought my own fears, transforming pain into art, charting new paths with each brushstroke. That night in the makeshift gallery was the starting point for everything. Daniel didn't just reject my work, he did it with an almost cruel pleasure, as if it were important to make sure that everyone around him knew exactly what he thought of me. "Is this really the best you can do, Lena?" He held my painting as if it were something dirty, something that barely deserved his touch. The audience laughed softly, embarrassed, but still complicit in the moment of humiliation he was orchestrating. I felt my face burn, tears welling up in my eyes. I knew he was arrogant, but I never imagined he could be so cruel. Worse still, part of me began to doubt. Was he right? Was I really wasting my time? My hands trembled as I tried to retrieve the painting from his hands, but he continued speaking, without mercy. "You know, art is about impact, about saying something that people need to hear. This says nothing." Those words stuck in my mind for days, weeks. I wanted to ignore them, but they echoed in every brushstroke, in every color I chose. They haunted me even in the quietest moments, when I should have been just creating. That's when I realized Daniel had touched something deep inside me. He had hit where it hurt the most, but not because I was a fraud, as he said. It was because I hadn't found my own voice yet, and that was something he could never take away from me. I decided to use that pain. I turned his criticism into fuel. Every cruel word he said, and would say, became a spark inside me. I started working tirelessly, painting until my fingers went numb, until I felt the weight of hours of effort accumulated on my back. But there was something different now. I was no longer painting just for myself. I was painting against him, against his words, against all the times he tried to belittle me. But the real challenge wasn't just proving him wrong about my art. It was also facing my own fears. Because deep down, I knew Daniel wasn't the only one who doubted me. I did that myself sometimes. There were days when I looked at my canvases and saw only imperfections, crooked lines, colors that seemed to scream failure. And in my most vulnerable moments, it was easy to imagine Daniel's voice there, mocking me again. So I decided that it wasn't enough to just create art. I needed to create something that would shake the foundations of Daniel's world. He dreamed of the Aurora Gallery, that iconic space he believed was his destiny. He had mentioned it several times, always with an ambitious gleam in his eyes. For him, the gallery represented validation, success, recognition. It was the place where he would finally be seen as the great artist he thought he was. And that's when the idea came to me. If I could buy the Aurora Gallery before he did, I could completely change the narrative. It wouldn't be just about art anymore. It would be about showing him, and myself, that I could achieve anything I wanted. I would transform that space into my own stage, a place where my works would dominate, and his presence would be reduced to that of a mere spectator. The plan was bold, almost impossible, but I knew it was worth a try. Because this story was no longer just about revenge. It was about overcoming, about finding my strength amid doubt and contempt. It was about proving that even when someone doubts you, the best response isn't hatred. It's shining so brightly that they have no choice but to see your light. And I was determined to shine. My first attempt at selling a piece was a complete disaster. I was full of hope when I set up my little tent at an outdoor art fair, the paintings carefully arranged against the makeshift wall. It was a sunny Saturday, and Melbourne was bustling with life. Children running around, couples strolling, and people stopping to look at the creations of local artists. I felt like I was part of something bigger in that moment, like I was finally on the right track. But then it happened. A tall man in a suit that screamed pretentious critic stopped in front of my booth. He looked at my canvases for a few seconds before letting out a short, dry laugh. "Is this serious?" he asked, not even trying to hide his sarcasm. I felt my stomach sink as he picked up one of my paintings, examining it as if it were a joke. "This looks like something a child would do," he said, returning the canvas to its stand with a sharp movement. And just like that, without further explanation, he walked away, leaving me there, frozen, while the sound of his laughter still echoed in my ears. I knew he wasn't the only person there. There were other visitors milling around the fair, admiring the works of other artists. But that public rejection felt like a punch to the chest. Every criticism Daniel had ever made about me came flooding back, and I could barely breathe. The people around me seemed to avoid my eyes, as if they felt sorry for me, but also wanted to keep their distance. It was humiliating. Even worse, it was devastating. When the day ended, I returned home with trembling hands and the feeling that it had all been a terrible mistake. I entered the apartment and threw my bag on the floor in frustration. The vibrant colors of my canvases seemed to mock me now, as if they were saying that I would never be good enough. I leaned my forehead against the cold window and watched the city outside, trying to find some comfort in that familiar landscape. But all I could see were the man's eyes at the market, full of contempt, and hear his cruel laughter repeating itself over and over in my mind. That's when I started to cry. It wasn't just because of him. It was because of everything. For Daniel's words, for the doubts I carried within myself, for the constant fear that maybe I really wasn't capable. Crying was liberating in a way. I washed my face with cold water and stood there, in front of the mirror, staring at my own red and swollen eyes. Who did I think I was to believe I could do this? Was it really worth continuing? However, something inside me refused to give up. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, but I knew I had to try again. That rejection couldn't be the end. It had to be the beginning of something new. I decided that if I wanted to improve, I had to work harder. Much harder. I started waking up before dawn and spent hours studying different techniques, watching online tutorials, reading books on composition, light, and perspective. I went to galleries and museums, observing every detail of the works that inspired me. I wrote everything down in an old notebook, scribbling ideas and notes in the margins. Little by little, I began to notice changes in my paintings. My brushstrokes became firmer, my colors more vibrant and intentional. There were still imperfections, of course, but they no longer seemed like flaws. They seemed like marks of my progress. I was learning to tell stories with my paintings, to put emotions into every stroke. And even if no one else saw it, I knew I was growing. But the real test came a few weeks later, when I decided to try again. I returned to the same art fair, this time with new works. I set up my booth with my heart racing, hoping no one would remember me. At first, things seemed the same. Few people stopped, and even fewer showed interest. Then an older woman with gray hair and round glasses slowly approached. She looked at my paintings for a long time before saying, "You have talent. This is special." Those words were like balm for my wounded soul. She bought one of my smaller paintings and encouraged me to keep going. At that moment, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I wasn't as bad as I thought. maybe I could make this work after all. But that small victory also brought a new wave of pressure. I knew I still had a long way to go, and that the next obstacle could be even bigger. Because deep down, I knew that proving my worth to strangers was just the beginning. The real challenge would be facing Daniel, and showing him that I was much more than he had ever imagined. That sale at the art fair was like a little ray of sunshine after a storm. The woman with the round glasses and the sincere compliment gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was as if someone had opened a door to a world where I could really be seen, where my art could touch people, even if only one at a time. I returned home that night with a new energy, almost floating. I placed the small bill she had given me on the table and stared at it for a long time. It was symbolic, of course. It wasn't even enough to cover the cost of the paints I used, but it meant so much more than its monetary value. In the months that followed, I continued to work tirelessly. My canvases began to come to life in ways I had never imagined before. My sketches were bolder, my colors more vibrant and full of intention. I was putting everything I had into every brushstroke: my insecurities, my victories, my internal battles. And little by little, I began to realize something incredible. People were noticing. Not just strangers on the street or occasional visitors to the fair, but also other artists and even some smaller galleries. I received invitations to participate in local group exhibitions, and for the first time, my work began to be displayed alongside pieces by artists I admired. It was during one of these exhibitions that I experienced what seemed to be the most important moment of my journey so far. It was a small gallery, but well respected in the Melbourne art scene. The event was packed, and for the first time, I felt like I was part of something bigger. People stopped in front of my canvases, asked questions, took pictures. Some even bought pieces. Nothing big, but enough to make me feel like I was on the right track. A local critic wrote a short article about the exhibition and mentioned my name. He said my work had a raw, emotional honesty that grabbed your attention. Those words stuck with me, like a reminder that I was making progress. But that's when the false sense of security set in. I started to believe that maybe I had already surpassed Daniel, that he didn't matter as much as he used to. I thought that if I kept going like this, I could just leave him behind without having to confront him directly. It was comfortable to think that my art spoke for itself, that I didn't have to prove anything to anyone but myself, until he showed up. It was a normal day at the gallery, and I was helping organize some pieces when I saw him walk in. He was impeccably dressed, as always, with that confident air I knew so well. At first, I didn't think he would even recognize me, but he saw me, smiled that condescending smile, and came straight over to me. "Lena," he said as if he were surprised to find me there. "So, you're exhibiting now? Interesting." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I tried to keep my composure. "Yes, I am," I replied, trying to sound indifferent. He glanced quickly at my screens and shook, his head slowly, as if evaluating something mediocre. "Good for you," he said, in a tone that sounded more like pity than admiration. "But this is still amateurish. You know that real art needs to have an impact, right? It needs to say something." Those words were like a stab in the gut. Everything I had achieved up to that point seemed to crumble in that instant. I felt like I was back at that art fair, being judged and rejected. The false confidence I had built up evaporated in seconds. Daniel hadn't changed. And worse, he still knew how to hit me where it hurt the most. That night, I returned home angry and frustrated. I stared at my canvases, which now seemed smaller and less impressive than before. For the first time in months, I doubted everything. Had I really improved? Or was I just deluding myself, chasing something I would never achieve? Because no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, one thing was certain. As long as Daniel continued to believe that I wasn't good enough, I would never be completely free of him. After Daniel's visit to the gallery, everything I had achieved began to seem fragile. His words stuck in my mind like a cruel, repetitive song, playing over and over again. He wasn't just doubting my talent. He was calling into question all, my progress. And worse, he was right about one thing. I hadn't made an impact. Not in the way I wanted to. My work was being seen, but it wasn't unforgettable yet. It still didn't say anything that made people stop and think. And that consumed me. I decided I needed to take it a step further. If I wanted to prove my worth, to myself, to Daniel, to the world, I would have to create something bigger, something that transcended simply being good. But how? I knew that just painting more wasn't enough. I needed to find a way to tell stories with my canvases, to transform raw emotions into something tangible, something that people could feel in their hearts, even if they didn't understand exactly why. So I decided to try something risky. A solo exhibition. It was an ambitious idea, perhaps even reckless. Solo exhibitions were for established artists, not for someone like me, who was still struggling to find her footing. But I knew I needed to push my own limits. I rented a small space in a quiet neighborhood in Melbourne, saving every penny I earned from previous sales. I worked day and night, creating an entirely new series of works. Each canvas was an exploration of my deepest emotions: fear, anger, loneliness, hope. I wanted anyone who looked at them to feel the weight of what I had been carrying inside me. But then came the real challenge. To promote the exhibition, I had to face something I had always feared: exposing my vulnerability publicly. I posted on social media, wrote a heartfelt piece about my journey, and invited people I barely knew. And of course, I sent an invitation to Daniel. I wanted him to come, not because I wanted his approval, but because I wanted him to see how much I had grown. I wanted him to witness the impact he thought I could never achieve. The night of the exhibition arrived, and I was nervous like never before. The space was packed, much more than I had expected. There were friends, strangers, local critics, and even some art collectors. People circulated through the rooms, looking at my paintings, murmuring among themselves. Some stopped for long minutes, motionless, as if sucked in by the colors and shapes. Others took photos or made notes. I could see in their eyes that they were feeling something. And for the first time, I felt that maybe I had finally found my voice. But then I saw him. Daniel slipped in, as if trying to go unnoticed. He was wearing a black overcoat, and his gaze was arrogant, as always. He began to walk around the space, analyzing my work with that critical expression I knew so well. I watched him from afar, trying to decipher his reactions. He didn't laugh or make sarcastic comments in front of the other visitors, but he didn't seem impressed either. When most of the people had left, he finally came over to me. "Interesting," he said, in that casual tone that hid venom. "You've really improved." For a moment, I thought maybe he was being sincere. But then he continued. "But it's still just the beginning. You know you're far from being recognized as a real artist, right?" Those words hit me like a punch in the stomach. All the confidence I had built up over the course of the evening evaporated in seconds. I felt my legs go weak, but I forced myself to stand firm. "What do you mean by real?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He shrugged, as if it were obvious. "Real art has to be grand, Lena. It needs to be seen in important places, by important people, not in a makeshift space like this." His criticism was a bucket of cold water. He wasn't just questioning my ability, he was questioning my ambition. And worse, he was right again. I knew that as long as my work was confined to small spaces and local events, I would never be taken seriously in the art world. But at the same time, I realized something important. Daniel didn't understand what I was trying to do. He saw art as status, as external validation. For me, It was about something completely different. That night ended with me alone in the empty space, staring at my canvases illuminated by the dim lights. I knew I had taken a big step, but I also knew I still had a long way to go. And for the first time, I understood that the real challenge wasn't just to surpass Daniel. It was to surpass his limited idea of success. I needed to create something that went beyond criticism, something that proved that art isn't about where it is, but about what it means. After that night at the solo exhibition, something changed inside me. It wasn't a sudden or dramatic change, but a silent weight that began to grow as I reflected on Daniel's words. He was right about one thing. Art wasn't just about talent or emotion. It was also about impact. And if I wanted to achieve the level of recognition I desired, I would have to make some difficult choices. That's when I was faced with the dilemma that would haunt me for weeks. I was surfing the internet when I came across an opportunity that seemed to be the answer to everything. A national art competition sponsored by a renowned gallery in Sydney. The winner would have their work exhibited in one of the country's most prestigious galleries and receive a scholarship to study with internationally acclaimed artists. It was exactly the kind of validation I needed, the kind that would make Daniel eat his words. But there was a problem. To participate, I had to submit a piece that was original and innovative. And that meant giving up something very personal. Over the past few months, I had been working on a series of paintings I called fragments. They were deeply autobiographical, depicting specific moments in my life. The pain of rejection, the loneliness of the years I doubted myself, the whirlwind of emotions I felt when facing Daniel. Each canvas was like a piece of me exposed to the world, something I never imagined sharing with anyone beyond the makeshift walls of my solo exhibition. But now, those canvases were my best chance to enter the contest. I spent days debating with myself. Was I ready to expose something so intimate? Was it worth sacrificing my privacy for recognition? The idea of strangers looking at those works and judging not only my talent but also my vulnerability terrified me. I had felt the weight of criticism before, but this would be different. Those paintings were part of my soul. But then came the thought that made me hesitate even more. What if I won? What if that contest finally put me on the artistic map for real? It would prove to Daniel, and to myself, that I was capable of achieving what he thought was impossible. That possibility shone like a light at the end of the tunnel, even though I knew the price would be high. On the day of the deadline, I stood in front of the computer for hours, my hands shaking as I held the mouse. I opened the files of the paintings and went through each one, reliving the moments they represented. I remembered how I felt when I painted each stroke, each splash of color. There was so much of me there, so much fear, so much pain, but also so much strength. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Then I clicked. Send. The following weeks were torment. I felt exposed, as if I had handed over a piece of myself to be judged by people who didn't even understand what I was trying to say. Every time the phone rang or I received an email, my heart raced. But nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks, and no response. I began to wonder if it had been a mistake. Maybe I had gone too far. Then one morning, I got a call. It was the contest organizer. My work had been selected as a finalist. I asked to sit down while she explained the next steps. I could barely process the words. I was in the finals. But there was one detail she mentioned at the end of the conversation. Now it's time for you to decide if you're ready to face the public. That phrase echoed in my mind. I knew that this decision wasn't just about winning or losing the contest. It was about who I wanted to be as an artist and as a person. Was I willing to put everything on the line, including my own emotional integrity? Or should I back down and protect what was left of myself? That's when I realized something important. The real challenge wasn't just to beat Daniel or gain external validation. It was to find a balance between being authentic and being strong enough to face the consequences of that authenticity. The news that my work was among the finalists in the competition left me in a state of euphoria mixed with panic. I knew this was the opportunity I had fought for so long, a chance to prove to myself, to Daniel, and to the world that I truly belonged in the art world. But I also knew that this final stage would be unlike anything I had ever faced before. It wasn't just a matter of submitting a painting or exhibiting in a makeshift gallery. Now I would have to face the judges, the audience, and above all, my own insecurities. The final event of the competition was set to take place in 2 weeks, and the pressure began to weigh on me like an invisible mountain. The instructions were clear. Each finalist would need to present their work in person, explaining the story behind it, and defending their creative process. This meant I couldn't just hide behind my canvases. I would have to talk about fragments, about what each brushstroke meant, about the pain and vulnerability I had poured into it. The idea of exposing my deepest wounds to strangers, critics, and possibly even Daniel paralyzed me. But what made it even more urgent was something I discovered a few days later. While scrolling through social media, I saw a post from Daniel. He was announcing that he had been invited to be one of the judges for the contest, an honor to participate in such a prestigious event, he wrote, with that false modesty I knew so well. My mind spun as I read the words over and over. How was this possible? How could he, someone who had always doubted me, be there, judging my work? That revelation changed everything. Suddenly, the contest was no longer just about artistic validation. It became a personal battle. I couldn't fail. Not in front of him. But at the same time, I felt afraid. What if he used his position to sabotage me? What if his opinion influenced the other judges? These thoughts consumed me, robbing me of sleep and causing me to question every decision I had made up to that point. I decided I needed to prepare my defense like never before. I spent days reviewing every detail of the fragment series, writing notes about what each canvas represented. I practiced my speech in front of the mirror, trying to find the right tone, strong enough to make an impact, but sincere enough to touch people. I wanted people to understand that these works weren't just about me. They were about everyone who had ever felt discredited, ignored, or underestimated. It was about turning pain into something beautiful, something universal. But the more I prepared, the more doubts arose. What if I wasn't good enough to convince the judges? What if they saw my work as small and insignificant compared to the grandiose pieces of the other finalists? Every criticism I had ever received echoed in my mind, amplified by Daniel's presence on the judging panel. I knew he would make a point of pointing out any flaws, any weaknesses. And then came the final blow. A few days before the event, I received an email from the contest organizers. They asked me to send a written statement explaining the concept behind my series, something that would be read by the judges before my presentation. I sat down at the table with my heart in my mouth, trying to put everything I wanted to say on paper. But as I wrote, I realized that it wasn't enough to just talk about my journey. I needed to directly confront what Daniel represented. I decided to include a sentence that summed it all up. This series is proof that art doesn't have to be grand to be important. It just has to be true. Submitting that statement was like tossing a coin in the air. I knew it could cost me dearly, especially with Daniel among the judges. But I also knew I couldn't back down now. This was the decisive moment. The point where I had to choose between hiding or facing my fears head on. And for the first time, I felt like I was ready to do it. When the day of the event arrived, the sense of urgency was almost unbearable. I entered the gallery with trembling hands, looking at the other artists and their impressive works. I knew I had given it my all, but I also knew that the outcome depended on something I couldn't control: the opinion of the judges. And deep down, I knew that no matter what happened, this moment would define who I was as an artist and as a person. I was about to face the biggest challenge of my life. Everything was at stake. I stood backstage at the gallery in Sydney, trying to control my breathing as I watched the other artists present their work. Each of them seemed so confident, so sure of what they were doing there. Their words flowed like music, confident and articulate, as they explained the meaning behind their creations. I knew that when it was my turn, all eyes would be on me, including Daniel's. And that left me with a feeling of dread that I could barely contain. The gallery was packed. There were art critics, collectors, journalists, and even some art students who seemed to be absorbing every detail like sponges. The lights were bright, casting soft shadows on the white walls where the works were displayed. The atmosphere was elegant, almost intimidating, and I could feel the weight of expectations in the air. It was as if everyone there was waiting for something extraordinary, something that would change their view of art forever. When they finally called my name, I felt my knees go weak. I took a deep breath and walked to the center of the space, where Fragments was on display. My hands were shaking as I adjusted the microphone in front of me. I looked out at the audience for the first time and immediately met Daniel's eyes. He was sitting in the second row, next to the other judges, with that indecipherable expression he always wore when he wanted to look superior. For a moment, I felt like I was going to collapse right there. But then I remembered everything I had gone through to get here. The rejection, the tears, the sleepless nights, the constant doubts. I couldn't fail now. I began to speak, my voice trembling at first. My series Fragments is about vulnerability, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Each canvas represents a moment in my life when I felt fear, pain, or loneliness. But it also represents something else. The strength that comes from facing those emotions and transforming them into something beautiful. I paused, looking at the works behind me. The room was silent, and I could feel all eyes on me. I continued. For me, art isn't about grandiosity. It's not about impressing anyone. It's about being honest, with yourself and with the world. As I spoke, I realized that my words were touching some people. I saw heads nodding in agreement, tears in the eyes of some women in the audience. But at the same time, I felt Daniel's gaze on me, heavy and judgmental. He didn't seem moved. He seemed calculating, as if he were looking for flaws in what I was saying. This made me hesitate for a moment, but then I decided to ignore him. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. I ended my presentation with the sentence I had written in the statement I sent to the judges. This series is proof that art doesn't have to be grand to be important. It just has to be true. When I said those words, I felt something inside me break free. It didn't matter anymore what the judges decided. I had said what I needed to say. I had shown them who I was. But the tension was far from over. After my presentation, the judges began to ask questions. Some praised my choice of colors and composition. Others questioned why I had chosen such personal themes. I answered as best I could, keeping my cool despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket before speaking. His tone was casual, almost friendly, but I knew there was venom behind his words. Lena, he began, with that subtle smile I knew so well. Your work is interesting, of course, but do you really believe that something so intimate can have an impact outside your own world? Art, after all, should transcend the individual, shouldn't it? I felt my heart race. This was exactly what I had feared. He was trying to discredit me in front of everyone. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I looked him in the eye and replied, Maybe that's exactly the point, Daniel. Maybe the individual is what connects us. When someone sees pain on a screen, it doesn't matter if it's mine or yours. It matters because they feel it too. That's the true power of art. The room fell silent for a moment. as if everyone was processing what I had said. Daniel looked, surprised for a brief moment, but quickly regained his impassive expression. He just nodded and sat back down without saying another word. That exchange was the turning point. I knew I had given it my all, confronted my greatest fears, and proven to myself that I was capable of facing any challenge. Now, all that was left was to wait for the verdict. While the judges gathered to deliberate, I sat in a corner of the gallery, trying to calm my nerves. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Every second seemed to last an eternity. And then, finally, the announcement was made. All the artists were called back to the center of the room. I could barely hear what was being said. My heart was beating so loudly that it drowned out everything around me. I knew that regardless of the outcome, I had already won something much greater, my own validation. But when the winner's name was announced, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. And the winner is Lena Harper. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. I looked over at Daniel, who was frozen in place, his face a mixture of shock and frustration. And then, as applause erupted around me, I realized that this was the sweetest victory I could ever imagine. The sound of applause echoed through the gallery like distant thunder, but everything around me seemed to slow down. I stood there, frozen in the center of the space, trying to process what had just happened. My name still reverberated in the air, spoken by the presenter with a clarity that made me question whether it was real. Lena Harper. Had they really chosen me? Among all the incredible artists there, I, the girl Daniel always called a fraud, had won. The judges began to applaud first, leading the audience in an enthusiastic wave. People were standing, some even whistling, as I slowly walked toward the stage to receive the award. My legs were shaking so badly that I thought I was going to trip, but I made it there. The trophy was heavy in my hands, almost as if it carried the weight of the entire journey that had brought me to that moment. I felt everyone's eyes on me, and for a brief moment I felt genuine pride. But then, inevitably, my eyes met Daniel's. He was sitting in the second row, motionless. His face was a strange mask, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something deeper that I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was shame, or maybe it was just the first time he realized he had underestimated someone beyond measure. He didn't applaud. He just sat there, frozen, while the rest of the room celebrated. When the presenter handed me the microphone to give my victory speech, I felt a lump form in my throat. I knew this was my final opportunity to confront him, not just as an artist, but as a person. I took a deep breath and looked out at the audience, my eyes fixed on Daniel before I began. I didn't expect this, I admitted, my voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. But if I've learned anything on this journey, it's that art isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about telling your truth, even when the world tells you you shouldn't. I paused, allowing the words to hang in the air. Then I looked directly at Daniel. There have been times when I doubted myself. There have been people who made me feel small, like I would never be good enough. But here I am. And this isn't just for me. It's for anyone who has ever heard you can't, and decided to keep going anyway. The audience erupted in applause, again, but Daniel remained motionless. He looked away, avoiding my gaze, and that told me everything I needed to know. I had won. Not just the contest, but also the silent game we had been playing for years. He had always tried to belittle me, to make me feel inferior. But now, in front of everyone, it was impossible to deny what I had achieved. After the ceremony, as I was talking to some admirers and critics, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around and there he was, standing uncomfortably, as if he were fighting with himself to say something. For a moment, I thought about ignoring him. He didn't deserve my attention, not after everything. But then, something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe compassion, made me wait. "Congratulations," he said, his voice low and tense. There was no sarcasm, no insincerity. For the first time, he seemed human. "You've really improved." Those words could have been a compliment, but I knew there was something more behind them. Reluctant admiration, maybe even a little respect. I stared into his eyes for a long moment, saying nothing. I didn't need to respond. He already knew. Then he turned and walked out of the gallery, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there, watching him go until he was completely gone. Part of me felt sorry for him. After all, he was a prisoner of his own ambitions and insecurities. But another, part of me knew that no matter what happened from that point on, I would never let someone like him control my life again. That night was a turning point. Not only had I proven my worth as an artist, but I had also faced my greatest adversary and survived. However, I knew that the internal battle was not over yet. Confronting Daniel was important, but the real challenge was to ensure that I never again allowed external doubts to shake my confidence. I had won the contest, but the biggest prize was yet to come, learning to trust myself completely. After Daniel left the gallery, I thought the moment had come to an end, a clear and definitive victory. But then, something happened. As I was talking to some journalists and admirers, one of the contest organizers came up to me with a strange look on his face. "Lena," he said hesitantly, "we need to talk in private." I felt a chill run down my spine. This didn't look good. I followed him to a room at the back of the gallery, where another member of the team was already waiting for me. There was a tension in the air that made me think something terrible was about to happen. Was there something wrong with my work? Or worse, had Daniel influenced the judges in some way? My mind raced in 1,000 directions as I tried to stay calm. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The organizer took a deep breath before answering. "We received an anonymous complaint shortly after the results were announced. Someone questioned the originality of your fragments series." Those words hit me like a punch in the stomach. Originality? How could anyone doubt that? Each canvas was a part of me. Each brushstroke carried emotions I had personally experienced. But then I realized that complaint could only have come from one person, Daniel. He must have planned this from the beginning, a last-ditch attempt to bring me down. "That accusation is absurd," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. "I created these works myself. They are entirely mine." The organizer nodded, but explained that due to the rules, they would need to formally investigate. Until then, my prize would be temporarily suspended. I left that room feeling like I had been dealt a low blow. Everything I had achieved was being called into question, and for the second time that night, I felt the weight of Daniel's words crushing me. But then, something inside me rebelled. I wasn't going to let him take this away from me. I had proof. Photos of the creative process, initial sketches, records of each stage of Fragmento's creation. I rushed home and gathered everything I had, determined to prove my innocence. The next day, I handed the evidence over to the organizers. They were impressed by the amount of material that supported my version. But the real twist came when Daniel himself was called in to clarify the anonymous complaint. Under pressure, he ended up admitting that he had made it all up. He said he didn't think I deserved the prize and that he wanted to test the integrity of the contest. When this information leaked to the press, Daniel was publicly ridiculed. Articles were written exposing his petty behavior, and he quickly became a pariah in the art world. For me, however, the biggest victory was not his downfall. It was the official confirmation that Fragments was entirely mine. My prize was restored and my reputation was even stronger. If you want to know how I turned humiliation into triumph and how I faced my greatest adversary without losing my integrity, sign up now. This story will inspire you to never give up, even when the world seems to be conspiring against you. That episode changed everything for me. Not only did I prove my artistic ability, but I also learned that truth and authenticity always prevail. And with that, I finally felt that I had found my true strength. After everything that happened, the victory, the false accusation, Daniel's public downfall, I finally had a moment to breathe. I returned home to Melbourne and sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by my canvases and brushes. I was exhausted, but at the same time light, as if a huge weight I had been carrying for years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. But as I looked at the walls covered in colors and emotions, I realized something important. That journey was never really about beating Daniel. It was about beating myself. Over the past few months, I had fought against as many internal demons as external ones. Every criticism Daniel made echoed inside me because, deep down, part of me always doubted. He only amplified what I already feared, that I wasn't good enough, that I would never belong in the art world. But facing him, exposing my vulnerabilities, in public, and proving my authenticity in front of so many people taught me something that no award or recognition could ever teach me, that my true opponent has always been myself. I sat by the window, looking at the city lights outside. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid. I wasn't worried about what others thought of me, or whether my art would be accepted. All that mattered was that I had created something, honest, something that came straight from my heart. And that honesty, that courage to be who I am, was more valuable than any trophy. But the impact of this went beyond art. I finally understood that Daniel's opinion should never have had so much power over me. He was cruel, yes, but he also served as a mirror. He reflected all my insecurities, all my fears and doubts, and by confronting him, I also confronted those parts of myself. I learned that my scars, the rejections, the criticism, the tears, were part of what made me strong. They shaped my voice, gave depth to my work, and brought me here. I thought about all the times I wanted to give up. At that art fair where the man laughed at my painting. At the solo exhibition where Daniel tried to belittle me again. At the contest when the anonymous complaint almost ruined everything. In each of those moments, I could have given up. I could have let their words define who I was. But I chose to continue. And it was in that choice, that conscious decision to move forward despite my fear, that I found my real strength. Now, as I looked at my paint-stained hands, I knew they told a different story from the one Daniel tried to impose on me. They told the story of a woman who turned pain into beauty, doubt into determination, and humiliation into triumph. And that story wasn't just mine. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt small, invisible, or incapable. I decided to do something I never thought I would do. I wrote a letter to Daniel. It wasn't filled with resentment or hatred, but with compassion. "You may not realize it," I wrote, "but you helped me more than you know. Your words were harsh, but they forced me to look inside myself and find something I didn't know I had. Courage. Today, I am grateful for that." I sent the letter without expecting a reply. I didn't need one. It was for me, not for him. Over. Time. I started working on a new series. I called it Rebirth. Each canvas represented a lesson learned, a battle won, a piece of me that had been rebuilt. But this time, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about celebrating who I was and the path I had taken to get there. When I finished the first painting in this new phase, I felt something I had never felt before. Peace. It wasn't a passive peace, but an active one. A feeling that no matter what the future held, I would be ready. Because now I knew who I was. and no one would ever take that away from me. This journey taught me that overcoming our greatest challenges isn't about defeating others. It's about rediscovering ourselves. It's about learning to trust our own voice, even when the world tries to silence it. And that's how, after everything, I finally found my freedom. The sense of closure I had longed for finally arrived. After the exhibition of my work at the gallery, in Sydney, and all the controversy surrounding Daniel, things began to settle, not just in the outside world, but inside me. With the official confirmation of my victory in the contest and the public exposure of Daniel's lies, I felt as if a long battle had come to an end. But the real outcome of this story didn't happen in the headlines or the applause. It happened in the quiet of my apartment in Melbourne, where I could look back and see everything clearly. I still remember the day I received the letter from the contest organizers reaffirming my position as the winner. They apologized for the investigation and said they had never doubted the authenticity of my work, but that they had to follow protocol. I understood. After all, integrity is something we all must preserve. What surprised me most was the requests for interviews and invitations to exhibit my work in renowned galleries around the world. My name was everywhere. Art magazines, specialized websites, even television programs. It was surreal. But as gratifying as all this recognition was, I realized that what really mattered had already been achieved. My inner peace. That endless conflict with Daniel, that constant feeling that I needed to prove something to him and to the world, was gone. He tried to bring me down, but in the process, he helped me build a solid foundation on which I could stand forever. His public defeat was just symbolism. The real triumph was what happened inside me. A week after the incident, I went to Aurora Gallery, the place I had secretly bought months earlier. It was exactly as I had dreamed. Immaculate white walls, soft lights that highlighted every detail of the artwork, and that air of anticipation that only the beginning of something great can bring. I turned it into my own gallery, dedicated not only to my art, but also to the art of other emerging artists who, like me, faced doubts and criticism. I wanted to create a safe space where people could tell their stories without fear of being judged. The opening of Galleria Aurora was a remarkable event. I invited friends, fellow artists, and even some journalists who had covered my career. But above all, I wanted it to be a celebration of resilience. In the center of the gallery, I placed the Fragments series, now complete with new canvases, that reflected everything I had learned. Each work was accompanied by a short text explaining its origin, not just the creative process, but the emotions and experiences that inspired it. It was pure vulnerability, and it touched many people deeply. When I saw the visitors' reactions, I knew I had made the right choice. Some cried in front of my canvases, others stood still for minutes, lost in thought. An elderly woman approached me at the end of the night and said, "Your art reminded me that it's worth fighting for our dreams no matter how difficult they may seem." Those words were like a blessing, a confirmation that I had fulfilled my purpose. And what about Daniel? He didn't show up at the opening, but I knew he was aware of what I had achieved. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because his absence spoke louder than any presence. He lost not only control over me, but also the dream he thought was his destiny. The Aurora Gallery was mine now, and I had turned it into something much greater than he could ever have imagined. That night, as I watched the lights in the gallery slowly go out, I realized that the main conflict had been resolved once and for all. I no longer had anything to prove to Daniel or anyone else. My art spoke for itself, and my journey was proof that when someone doubts you, the best response is not hatred, but overcoming. I won, not just the contest or the dispute with Daniel, but mainly the battle against my own fears. As I left the gallery, I looked up at the starry sky and smiled. Finally, I was free. The consequences of that journey unfolded in ways I could never have predicted, not only for me, but also for the people around me. Winning the contest and exhibiting at the Aurora Gallery marked a turning point, a watershed moment that changed everything. For starters, my life as an artist finally took off. Exhibition offers began pouring in from all corners of the world: New York, Paris, Tokyo. Collectors wanted to buy my work, and critics wrote about how fragments had touched something deep within people. But most importantly, I stopped worrying about external validation. Now, creating art was a genuine expression of who I was, without fear of judgment. The Aurora Gallery also became a success beyond my expectations. I turned it into an inclusive space where emerging artists could show their work without fear of rejection. Many of them came to me after events, sharing their own stories of struggle and overcoming adversity. A young painter once told me, "You showed me that it's possible to keep going even when it feels like the whole world is against you." Those words reminded me of where I myself had started, full of doubts and insecurities. Knowing that I was helping other people find their voice was one of the greatest rewards I could imagine, but the most impactful change happened within me. I finally stopped comparing myself to others, especially Daniel. He had completely disappeared from the art scene after the false accusation scandal. I don't know exactly what happened to him. After that, some people said he tried to start over in another city, while others speculated that he had given up art altogether. To me, it didn't really matter. What he did was cruel, but it was also the catalyst for my transformation. If it weren't for him, I might never have discovered the strength that had always been inside me. My relationship with other people also changed. Before, I kept my emotions and vulnerabilities secret, afraid of being judged. Now, I spoke openly about my struggles and achievements, inspiring others to do the same. This created deeper and more meaningful connections. My friend Clara, who has always supported me behind the scenes, once said, "Lena, you have no idea how your story has helped people face their own challenges." That made me realize that my journey wasn't just personal. It had the power to touch lives. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were times when criticism still hurt, especially when someone questioned the authenticity or value of my work. But now, it didn't bring me down like it used to. I learned to filter out what mattered and ignore the rest. My focus was on continuing to evolve as an artist and as a person, always looking for new ways to tell stories through my art. As for Galleria Aurora, it became more than a physical space. It was a symbol of resilience. People came from far and wide to visit, not just to admire the artwork, but to feel the energy of overcoming adversity that permeated every corner. Even some of the contest judges showed up at one of the exhibitions, praising the impact the gallery was having on the artistic community. It was proof that sometimes the best legacy we can leave behind isn't just about ourselves, but about what we've been able to build for others. In the end, I realized that the consequences of this journey went far beyond Daniel and me. They touched lives, opened doors, and proved that when we face our fears head-on, we can create something truly lasting. And as I watched the gallery filled with smiling, chatting people, I knew that this was the greatest victory of all. Sitting on the wooden bench in the gallery, watching people interact with the artwork on display, I began to reflect on everything this journey had meant. It wasn't just about art or success. It was something much bigger. It was about overcoming obstacles, authenticity, and the courage to face our own demons. This central theme has permeated every moment of my life in recent years. From that first humiliation in the makeshift gallery to winning the contest and creating Galleria Aurora, I learned that the real enemy was never Daniel, but rather the inner voices he amplified. Those doubts that whispered that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong in the art world, that my emotions were too small to matter. He just shed light on something that already existed within me. But by confronting him, I also confronted those voices. And in the process, I discovered something incredible. That my scars, fears, and vulnerabilities didn't make me weak. They made me strong. They shaped who I am, gave depth to my art, and helped me connect with other people in ways I never imagined. This journey also taught me that the impact of art goes beyond aesthetics. It's not about creating something perfect or grand. It's about telling stories that touch people's hearts. When I saw a woman's eyes well up in front of a canvas that represented pain and resilience, I understood that my mission as an artist was not to impress, but to move people. That's why I turned Galleria Aurora into an inclusive space where anyone can share their story. Because at the end of the day, we all carry fragments of pain, hope, and struggle, and it is through these fragments that we find connection. Another important lesson was about validation. For so long, I sought external approval, wanting to prove to Daniel and the world that I was capable. But now I know that the only validation that really matters comes from within. If I believe in my voice, in my worth, no one can take that away from me. Winning the contest and exhibiting at the gallery were important milestones, but they don't define who I am. What defines me is the courage to keep creating, even when the path is difficult. And finally, I learned about compassion, both for others and for myself. Daniel was cruel, but he was also human. He was trapped by his own ambitions and insecurities, and that made him act meanly. At first, I wanted revenge. I wanted him to suffer for the things he put me through. But over time, I realized that he was already suffering, trapped in his own prison of ego and failure. Sending him that letter was an act of liberation, not just for him, but for me. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to move forward without carrying the weight of resentment. Looking back, I see that this story isn't just about art or revenge. It's about growth. It's about finding beauty in difficulties and strength in falls. It's about learning to trust your own path, even when it seems uncertain. And it's about remembering that when someone doubts you, the best response isn't hatred, but to shine so brightly that they have no choice but to see your light. Today, when I think about everything I've been through, I feel gratitude. Gratitude for the difficulties that made me grow, for the people who supported me, and even for Daniel, who, without knowing it, helped me discover who I really am. This is the message I want to leave the world. Life is made up of challenges, but it is these challenges that make us who we are. And in the end, what matters is not what we face, but how we choose to face it.